Welcome to AI-driven business, how to use your own data. Thank you for joining Envision. It's been great to see you all here. Today, our presenter is Loren Horsagar, CEO and founder of The Model Mind. He's our keynote speaker. This is his breakout session for the day. Welcome, Loren.
All right, so this is where the rubber meets the road, right? So every business deals with data, and if AI is going to change our organization, it has to deal with data. So we're going to dig into some of the specifics, like how you use AI with your data, and there's going to be two critical things that we're going to touch on that you need to understand. So we're going to look at some real processes. We're actually going to look at a little bit of code. You don't have to be technical. If you're not technical, don't worry about it, but we are going to look at some code just so you can see some real things run and what happens in those processes, and we'll talk through that a little bit. So the first thing I want to do is, what are the cases where you'd want to use data? So we're going to look at a few use cases. We're going to talk about a chatbot. We're going to talk about processing data. So the two cases where we talk about data, the one is I want to chat with my documents. So from a chat perspective, it's called retrieval augmented generation. Basically what happens is you have a repository of the data you have, and I can chat with that. But the brain is really, really, really tiny for any LLM system. So it can only take a small subset of that at any given time. So that's one way to do that, but we can talk to our data, but we can only pull a small set back. Processing data is a very different process. So let's say I need to step through every record of something that I'm dealing with, and I need to apply a process to that. We're going to take an example. We're going to look at some Amazon reviews, or I think Yelp reviews actually, and we're going to run through and process every row. So we're going to call an AI process on each row of data so that every row gets the same treatment. Over here in our first example, it's very, very different. We're just using that to fill, to add to our chat prompt that we're actually providing to AI, where here we can define a process that we're going to actually execute something with AI. And we're going to look at both of those examples. We're going to look at a couple more. One of them is creating documentation. There's lots of content creation type things we saw in the keynote. We're going to talk about one of them, which is documentation, which is really cool, and then how would you go about writing a blog post or writing a process to write a blog post using AI. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the chat piece initially, but these are the two different ways that you can integrate with your data. All right, so chat. So we talked about how I chat on OpenAI, right? Anybody here not used ChatGPT? One person? Two people? People are slowly. I asked it the other way around to see if anybody's brave enough. But so chatting it's like a Google search, right? Except it's really not like a Google search. It's about the process of communicating with it to get to the right answer. And your first result is probably never the right answer, right? So you have to keep the conversation going. But there's other information that goes into a message. So when we send that message, the first message says, I'm going to send a message, and then it comes back with a response. When I type in the next message that gets sent, all of this gets bundled together, including the next message, and gets sent over. However, there are things that are happening behind the scenes that you don't actually see that are getting sent with this. So why don't you get the same response every time you ask the same question? Any ideas? What's that? Context for sure, but if I ask exactly the same question, you'd probably expect the same answer. It could be learning, but part of what happens is they pass the date time along. And the date time, that could actually produce a little bit. It's going to go through the algorithm just a little bit different and produce a different number or a different value. Every bit of context that got passed in matters in order to actually produce a result. So you can get, it might both be right answers, but they could be a little bit different, right? Even though you asked exactly the same question. So it's something to think about, that it can't be repeatable. However, there is a way now. Just on Monday, there was a lot of big announcements from OpenAI. There's also some Google announcements. There is a way to repeat where you can actually pass in a sequence code and say, always use this sequence, so that you're guaranteeing the same starting point and getting the same answer. So now this is coming out as a way to actually maintain that, so you can rerun the exact same thing and get the same answer. Okay, so as we're chatting, what else gets put into this message? all of our history gets put in, or up until a point where it runs out of space. But we also put in our documents that we're attaching to this. So this is that search capability we're putting in those documents. And we fill that space up and then submit that to chat, and it produces an answer, right? So we're gonna actually do something right here. So I just did this today. I've never done this before, and I'm gonna show you how easy this is. So this is on ChatGPT. If you have a Plus account, $20 a month, we actually, can you see that? Oh, that's as good as it's gonna get, but sorry. So I'll talk you through it. It's real, but it looks bad. Okay, so basically what I did, I went out to ChatGPT and they have this new capability. This just came out on Monday, so that's why I haven't tried it. I've been traveling the last few days, and I thought, since the keynote, I actually just did this about an hour and a half ago to try it. So what I did, I actually went out here and it says, what do you want this chatbot to do? And I said, I want it to build a chatbot to provide answers about Network Center, a managed service provider in Fargo, North Dakota, provide feedback on our services and capabilities, be friendly and informative, and only provide correct answers from the website, and I gave it the website. All those pieces are critical, and because I've been doing lots of prompting, we put those in there. So asking for correct answers, who thinks you have to do that? But you actually have to tell it, I want correct answers. Don't give me anything that's not a correct answer. Tell me there is no information. So by providing that part of the prompt, it's giving me a correct answer or it's gonna give me nothing at all. And I gave it the website, and it says, okay, sounds good, gave it a name. It actually came back with that response. So that's all I told it, right? One response. Now, in this case, I gave it the website for Network Center, but I could have also uploaded files to actually be associated with this, right? And so now those files would be looked up, how we were talking about the RAG, the remote, the file retrieval process to actually integrate that data in here. But what's gonna happen, so here there's a preview for this. So I actually went out and asked for some information about Network Center, and it actually responded with details off of the website about Network Center. This took me 5 minutes to do, having never done it before. So this is pretty cool. What's cool about this though, is you could actually go up here, hit the drop down by the save, and I could say, I actually want to publish this, and I want to drop this on my website and have a chatbot to do service calls on my website, right? Okay, that's what you think about as a chatbot. However, they don't call these chatbots, they call them GPTs. So I'm actually creating a GPT, which is, if you, in the session this morning, it's basically building out a flow with context, and now we can build up multiple flows and call those. So I can drop this, I could have this available on they have a new store, I could actually drop it on the ChatGPT store, and someone else could run this without knowing anything about it, and they could just put in their query and start to interact with the data set and the data I put in behind the scenes on how I want responses to prompts. Which is really cool when it comes to now the next step of how we're gonna program things to actually take advantage of other data sources and then call these flows, which we know produce a result around these prompts. Does that make sense? We have a small group. You can ask questions and interact if you have a question. All right, so let's jump back from this.
Where would you attach a file?
If you go in the configure part, there's a way to attach a file. And since Monday, you can actually attach a half, I think it's a half gig, 512 megs maybe? Something like that, which it was tiny, tiny, tiny before, yeah.
What kind of files, file types do it support?
That's a good question. So what type of files does it support? So it does not support Excel. It does not support structured data, basically. So AI is not great at structured data, and so we're gonna look at an example of how you work with structured data versus informational data. So everything has to be converted to a text file behind the scenes. So it'll allow you to upload PDFs, it'll upload text documents, CSVs, all sorts of things like that. But it will not support Excel files, which I think is interesting. Our system, we do something very similar to this in our system, which we're gonna look at in a second. But that works, it works the same way, because Excel doesn't make sense to actually have retrieval out of it, because you can't guarantee you're gonna get the full record. So it's an interesting thing about the difference of two different types of data. So, all right, so we talked about this a little bit, how this works to build up a message and a response. And then I just want to call this out one more time, that you have a limited brain, basically, that can only take a certain amount of data. So you have to think about this is critical for getting good results. If you exceed that, you're going to, or the data, like let's say you added some data on from the retrieval process, you upload files, and some of that's going to get interjected in here. Half of this gets knocked off, but here's where you're setting the context of what you're trying to look for. It lost that context. So now you have some data and you have some questions, but it's not related. So you're going to get a bad result. All right, so this is the second way to deal with data. So this is where you're going to process data. So now let's take an Excel file. Okay, if I have an Excel file, and we're actually going to do an example of this, how do I do that? Well, I can use any programming code. This is not in AI. I'm going to start a loop, and I'm going to go through each record. This could be a database, it could be an Excel file, and I'm going to run my AI process on that. Now, what's cool about what happened on Monday and what we looked at with the chat, I could actually, instead of just calling a chat, I could call a predefined GPT that has a whole bunch more rules in it to run my process with additional data behind the scenes, which is really cool. This is a massive improvement. And then I am going to update my record and write that back to my Excel file or my database, right? So it's an iterative process stepping through every record. I need to process all these records. It's not a lookup where I get a little bit of data. So what happens, clients call me and say, I uploaded a document. We'll actually flip over. This is our tool, ModelMind, and basically what happens is we have the ability to create different data sets. So we approach it a little bit differently. We can create different data sets for different things that we're targeting, and then we can upload data to those, and then we can chat with that data, right? So someone uploads a file, and then they go to chat with it, and they say, hey, it didn't pull all the data from my file, but it's never going to do that. It's only going to go find the most relevant data that tied out to that by searching when you're chatting with it. If we want to step through every process of it, we need to use this other data, this other process and a different flow. All right. All right.
Can you go back to that last slide for 1 second?
Maybe. This is funky here. This slide?
Yeah, so for that process, are you going to go into an example of X?
Yes, I'm going to walk through this exactly, so we'll come back to that. All right. So chat with your data. We kind of dug into this, but I want you to understand a little bit more about what happens when you upload a file to, whether it's us or to OpenAI or whatever. So it is not in a format that can be read. So everything in ChatGPT is numeric. It's a series of vectors, and those vectors determine your output, and it's just a mathematical model. So first what has to happen, it has to be in a text format to actually be able to get converted into vectors, and then we ask a question, that actually gets converted into vectors and then gets output. So here's what's happened. You don't have to understand this, but I want you to understand what's happening behind the scenes when you do this, because it does dictate how you're going to work with this. So the first thing that happens, you upload a document, we convert it to text. Now the other thing is your text document might be more than what our AI brain can handle at any time, so we have to chunk this down to sizes. So we actually create a whole bunch of chunks out of that. Then the next thing is, we're going to create embeddings out of that. An embedding is a special AI call that we actually make to a different, if you're familiar with like ChatGPT 3.5, ChatGPT 4, there's actually, it's called ADA text embeddings. That's how we get our text embeddings. It's a special AI process to create these vectors. So we pass in our data set, and we get vectors back that are actually going to help us search for this. Then what happens, maybe, oh, so, they get loaded into our vector database, right? Let's just load all these. All right, so they get loaded into our vector database. So now that sits there, and now we can go chat with this data. How we do that is your normal chat interface. I'm going to go create a message. It comes back with a response. Going to go create the next message, and this happens every time you do it. It's going to go out and take your message and convert that into its own vector. So it's going to run this add a text embedding process, and then it's going to go call our database and say, get me the most familiar data. And in our case, we take the top 5 matches to that, and we embed that with this specific message. So we can use that amount of data to get embedded with this and answer our questions. If it's not in there, it's not going to be part of your answer. Now, at the same time, you also have access to everything that the underlying model knows. So whatever it was trained on can also be accessible, but anything specific that we're adding to that has to go through this process and has to fit in that call.
Real quick, Loren, with asking these questions, is there a way to get a better way to ask a question if you don't know exactly you're getting the output you're wanting?
Yes. So the best way to do that is to actually ask chat. So what we do a lot of times, like if you're stuck in your chat process, ask chat, here's what I want to do, how would you recommend I ask the questions? That's one way to do it. The second is, can you ask me questions? Here's what I want to do. Can you ask me questions to get there? And then chat will start asking you questions. And you just respond to those questions, you get much, much better results.
Thanks.
Especially when you're doing a more complicated process where you need access to certain data. It's like, can you tell me how I would actually query this data? It'll tell you. All right, let's ditch that. All right, we talked about the size limits. So basically, the cool thing about this, building your own chat bot, is you can use your own data and get into talking to it. Now let's get into the process one. So our example for this is we're going to use, what happens a lot is, and chat is fantastic at this, AI is very good at this, is taking qualitative data and making it quantitative. So we're going to look at an example that is, it's reviews, right? So let's go look at our data set, which is down here. Well,
technical capacity limit, or is it just because they're trying to control?
It's a technical. So right now what happens, this is a good question. My Excel file got closed, so this might not, I might not go find it because I don't know where it is. So we're going to skip that. But what I do want to do is show you the process of how this works. So the size, well, let's talk about the size though. So the size right now, if you go out on ChatGPT, is 4,000 tokens. A token is roughly a syllable. So, but what that 4,000 tokens is, that's for your input and it's for your response combined. So they also, for double the money, you can go to 32,000 tokens. And for approximately double the money again, you can now go, as of Monday, you can go to 128,000 tokens. So obviously the more you can fit in there, the more complicated problems you can have it respond to. So it depends, and there's actually, in almost every programming language now, there's token counters. You can count tokens before you submit it and get an error and realize it's too many tokens. So you can calculate that out ahead of time.
And then are you also paying for processing, or do you just have that flat fee and then you use it?
So that's a good question. So with ChatGPT, you are paying, you can pay for the monthly service, and if you go through the chat interface, you're only paying your $20 a month, right, for the Plus account. If you're going to use the API, you get for every call that you make, there's a cost, and that ranges between like 1/10 of a cent to about 3 to 6 cents. For like the 128K one, I think goes up to like 6 cents per token, or per 1,000 tokens rather. So it's reasonably cheap, unless you're going to run lots of them. Like I've run, one time I ran 63,000 AI calls in 4 hours, and I got a hefty bill. So you have to understand what you're going to do and how many calls you're going to make and have an idea what that cost is. There's also tools to build into your system of like, okay, here's your design, here's what this is probably going to cost roughly, so you can get pricing calculators into that. But most of the things we're running, it's like, oh, I'm going to run this job, and it's going to come back with a very, it's going to cost 1/2 cent or something. So.
That totally, that's just the one question, one answer. Does that include the reference questions previously?
It includes everything. So all of that is one message that's going in, and you need all that to go in. So this is why it gets trimmed off pretty quickly, especially if you're doing large prompts and lots of information. That gets trimmed down pretty quickly because it has to have enough space to send the response back. There's also some, behind the scenes when you're working with the API, there's a whole bunch of additional controls that you don't really think about and don't have control. If you wanted to see these, you can actually play with these through a nice interface on, if you go to playground.openai.com. There's things, for example, temperature is one. So temperature, you can go from 0 to 1, and you can actually tell it how creative you want it to be. So certain things we do, we want it to be super creative. Other things we want it to be, no, this has to be this exact answer, or don't give me an answer at all, right? So there's controls over that, but there's also a control to say, I want to limit my token account to be 1,000. So that's your return tokens. So don't give me 5 pages of text coming back when I really just need a paragraph to describe this. So there's a whole lot of more controls behind the scenes that most people aren't playing with because they don't really need to right now. Okay, so this is, I'm going to show you some code, but if you don't code, that's not a big deal. This is a little tool that I use called LinkPad, and it basically allows me to run C# code. And so you can see here, we're actually building up, well, this is just our Excel library that we're going to use. We're authenticating. This is using ours, is very similar to doing it with OpenAI, but we're using our platform, which runs on Azure OpenAI, and we're going to build a flow. So basically what we're doing is defining a series of skills or prompts that this flow can do, right? And then we're going to call that flow, and we'll get to that in a second. But in this case, I want this to do, this is our code to do our review process, to review our Amazon or our Yelp reviews. And what I want to do, and you're going to see this in a second, here's my definition for this review. So I want to create a review summary. What am I telling it to do? So I'm giving it a bunch of information. I want you to analyze this review data from a restaurant, and this is customer data, and I want you to do several things with that, including I want you to provide a rating from 1 to 5. Very, very descriptive, where 1 is terrible and 5 is excellent, right? So you have to tell it that. It doesn't know which way is 1, which way is 5, so you have to be descriptive. Determine the key functional area of the restaurant for the review. So was it good food? Was it good service? Was it the experience? Like those kind of things. And then on that one, that's kind of like what you'd call an enum in programming. I want specific categories for it to choose from. I don't want it to be anything that it makes up. So how am I going to do that? I'm just going to add in text here, and I have 5 different options: food, service, cleanliness, speed, and experience. So I define these, but now how do you work with this in a programming structure? Well, I also tell it what the output of this should look like. So in this case, I'm saying I want a JSON formatted output that's going to have these 2 values, so the functional area and the rating, and I'm showing an example, and I always want you to return that. And I also think I tell it in here that if it doesn't have a functional area that it matches, just leave that blank. So rather than filling in something or guessing, I want it to be blank. So I'm telling it that, and I can't show you the Excel file, but basically what happens is on every review now, so we're going to finish building this and adding it to make a step, which we're just going to make that our 1 step. So it's just 1 prompt in our flow. So now what we're going to do, and this is all just normal coding. This has nothing to do with AI. We're going to step through our Excel file. I had 27 rows to go through here. So we're just going to go through, pull our content in, which is our prompt, and then it's going to go through, or actually up here, I guess this is, we're going to go through and pull in our review, which is what we pulled out of Excel. We're going to run this process, which is what this step does right here, and we get back our data. So if our data has this functional area and rating, we're going to write that back to Excel and save this. So what's really, really cool about this, the data I had initially was just a whole bunch of text reviews, right? 1 column in Excel. Now I have 3 columns in Excel. The second one is the ratings, and it's a numerical thing I can sort by. I can say, hey, give me the, what are the top ratings and what do they look like, and is there a way that we can promote that or something, right? So there's questions. You can use your normal data management tools, data analytics tools to actually process things. But now combine that with the 3rd column that we added, which is what is the area. So now I could say, like, here's something we're doing with a client, is we're actually putting in and tying this out to who possibly served you or what area it was served. So can we actually say, hey, this was done by this team and they always have a 5-star service, right? But their food always sucks. Why is that? Like, we could get unique analysis that comes out of it because now we've created the data based on the data we had going in, which was only text data. We can now get the mathematical data to actually run real reports to refine what we can look at. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? I'm going to tell you about one more story while I switch gears here about something we're doing. So we're working with a brewery in St. Paul, and the brewery's question was their issue. They're like, can we use AI for this? Their issue is we're never staffed right. So we're either overstaffed or understaffed. If we're understaffed, we get terrible reviews. If we're overstaffed, we're wasting money, and it's a lot of money. So how do we staff better? So this is really interesting. They have data, so we could take that data in and train our model, and we could use that, our model now, to go out and have a much more complicated flow, where rather than just going through and reading in each item in the Excel file, it goes out so they're gonna run this every week. We think they're gonna run this and build an hourly staffing plan, actually, going forward. And they can rerun this every day or multiple times a day. We're gonna go pull the weather in. What's the weather like? This is in St. Paul, so if there's a Vikings game, their numbers go way down because they're in St. Paul. If there's a Gopher game, their numbers go up. They're not very far from campus. So, and if there's an event, all these things trigger how their numbers work, and we're using that to better calculate what staffing they need to actually be on staff at that time to get better service. And it's not a very complicated process. We're doing a lot more steps than this, but it's just an interesting thing. We're kind of combining both parts of this into one more complicated thing. It ultimately makes probably 30 AI calls to run this job, but it also makes about 50 probably data calls, web browsing to go look up different sites, events, all these other things. So it's tying all that together in the right flow to actually get a result. They get an Excel sheet that says, here's what we need to staff, and they can staff to that. So it's a pretty cool process. All right, go ahead.
Those factors you came up with, were those just ones like you guys create where I'm going with this is can you also utilize AI for looking to find other corroborative features like that, about situations that would drive traffic, like why is this day busy? We don't know why.
So they gave us a list, and then we went to ChatGPT and started dialoguing. So we are always using chat. We're building flows and building these more complicated things. We're always using chat in almost everything we're doing. So they came to us with this, and we went and queried. We did some web searches too, like what's out there, how does this work, what are the problems with these systems? And then we went and queried ChatGPT. What data do you think would be useful for this? We have these sets of data. What are we missing? Where would you get that data? And it produced it all for us. So, yeah. So we're definitely using that in everything else we're doing. So, I think it's interesting. So, we live like a lot of us live in a very creative process. Like I need to figure out. It's not a task I do every day, but I need to solve this problem. And ChatGPT is a fantastic resource for that. Sometimes with your own data. Sometimes you don't need your own data. But it's a great resource to start to dialogue with and come to a resolution of how do you do this. Somebody was asking earlier today, will it write code, right? And so it actually will write code that you can run in your system, which is fascinating. I think you were. Yep. So what's great about that, not only does it write the code, but it tells you how to run this code. It tells you what the code does. So it's really descriptive, and you can tell it to be more descriptive, less descriptive, but you can get to the solution, right? So rather than a web search that I have to go find out how does it do this, and how does it, who this says this says that, give me the answer, and tell me how you got the answer, and tell me how I implement the answer. So that's one thing that you're always doing, and this applies every day in your life, right? We're all trying to solve one-off things that we have to figure out. Then there's the business processes that I need to do this over and over and over. I need to do it with the same data set, or I need to do it every day, every hour to calculate out like the brewery. There's all these different things that we need to build a flow or a process that then can get executed with the same set of prompts, the same set of tools that it integrates to actually get our result consistently. So this is kind of the two views. Does that make sense? All right, we're going to look at a documentation case very quickly.
Loren.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Is it actually able to output as a file, or does it just output text in the format of a file?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So if you're going through ChatGPT, it's just coming in your screen and you can see it. However, if you're going to run a flow, and there's a whole assortment of tools out there that does this, and our tools does this, and is what we're looking at, we can actually have it output those files. And it can output it if you're using ChatGPT and you want Python code. So specifically, Python code is designed to do that. The reason is you can actually now, if you're a Plus member in ChatGPT, you can execute Python code as part of your process. So one of the things, I wasn't really going to dig into this today, but I think we will for a second, is called functions. So there is an ability when you send that message, another thing that can be included in that is a list of functions that you're going to give your AI access to. So when we think about all the negative things that can happen unexpectedly with AI, this is how this happens, is because I give it a whole list of functions that it can do. I'm going to allow you to read a file, and here's the method calling that you need to do that. I want you to write a file. Here's how you call those methods. I want you to browse the internet, and there's a call process for that. So one of the great things that we can do with that is lots and lots of REST APIs out there now, right? So I can connect to all my systems probably pretty much with the REST APIs. So I'm a developer, I could go write this code, but what if I don't want to write this code, or I don't know how to write this code to actually integrate this system with this system? Use ChatGPT now, point it at the REST document, the API documentation, and have it write the code. So I actually have been doing a demo, an example with Trello. I don't know, anybody familiar with Trello? It's a project management tool. You can do Kanban boards. And so I wanted to actually create a process that would allow me to go in and create a task. And I could create my task and say, I want you to write a book on something, right? Or write a blog post, let's say. And I can assign that to my bot. My bot gets called from that. It picks it up. It runs the whole flows. It's a whole massive series of flows. And then it comes back, and all of a sudden on Trello, all of a sudden I have a task that pops up assigned to me. It says, hey, I went and did the research for this. I'm not writing it yet. I want feedback from you. So now it opens a chat window, and I can chat with it. And I can dialogue with it and say, all right, this outline looks good, but let's refine this, let's refine that, and let's go back and forth and get a better outline. It says, all right, are you happy with this? We've gone through a few chats potentially, got an answer. Okay, now hit go, and now I see my bot is working in Trello again. So I'm not even interfacing through an AI interface. I'm interfacing through Trello to my technology, to my AI. And it's popping up tasks for me. So again, in a little bit, it's going to go out and do more work. Then it pops up and says, hey, here's the final result. Do you like it? No? Okay, tell me why. Let's refine this and keep going. So rather than me using a chat interface, there's other ways to do that. And the ability to integrate with REST APIs is mind-bogglingly cool when you can call functions on all your systems that you already have in-house with AI. So they're not off the table. The ability to integrate with them, as long as they have a REST API, is super, super simple. You can also do this through like command line parameters as well in things. I think it's a much better structure if you can use a REST API, but some systems don't have that, right? So for all you systems engineer guys, that's something a way that you might want to look at things in the future. All right, I am going to show you this just briefly. How would you approach code documentation? Any ideas? So I have a library of source code, and I want to document it. As an example, I have a client that came to me a few weeks ago, and they had written a whole new program, and the developer left, and it's been a year, and they have no way to interact with this code. They don't understand how it works. They need it for another system, and they're getting desperate. They have no documentation on it. How would you do that? So it's directories and directories of code. So here's what we did. And this is modified slightly for public consumption, but it is exactly the code that I used with them. So basically I said, hey, here I have a .NET MAUI application, which is a new mobile application format. I want you to go review this. I want you to summarize it, and I want you to create a markdown language output, and I want you to document all the fields, properties, methods, but write everything I want out of there. So now it's a whole bunch of files. How do I handle this? Well, none of the files exceeded my size limit for the brain, right? So I could pass them in directly. I didn't have to chunk them. So that saved a little bit of time. But what I did, I then create that step. And now what I did, I just am iterating over, and this is all normal C# code. This is nothing in AI. I'm iterating over in this process directory and say, find all the files. And I'm dealing with C# files. Find all the C# files. Run it through that prompt over and over and over again, and save it to my markdown file. And I end up with 50 pages of code, and I was going to run this live, but that's not going to work. So I think I already cleared it out. Let me get to the right document. Oh, it's actually here. Fantastic. Let's go to Markdown. So this is what it created. And this is the view in Markdown. So it actually went through, and this is a template. This is partially a test. This is against some code I was playing with. But it actually went through, and if I scroll down here, it has class after class and namespace, all the calls. What's cool is when it comes to a method, it actually puts in an example. How do I call this? And it documents that. If I have document in the code, which, right, a good developer should have some documentation, it'll pull some of that in and help. If it doesn't, it'll try to document it, which is fantastic. So not only do you have the documentation, you have real documentation. How do I call this? How do I use this? And what does it do? Which is pretty cool. So Any questions on that? Does that make sense?
Are you willing to share some of that C# code? If not, I get it. Are you?
The C# code? No. That's my secret sauce.
So who, all the code that comes out of this system, and I know that, who owns it?
So that's a good question. So on this is an announcement. And so this is why in the keynote I talk about you need to understand the EULA agreements of every company that is touching your data. So this changed on Monday. So, well, this didn't change completely. However, on Monday, OpenAI said if you're using our product, we'll actually defend you against any copyright issues that come up with anything that comes out of this. If you're a paid subscriber through Plus or using the API with OpenAI, you own everything that goes in and everything that comes out now. This wasn't the case 6 months ago. But now you own everything that goes in and everything that comes out. If you're using a different system, I don't know. We're mostly tied with OpenAI, and we're actually using the Azure implementation. The same holds true if you're using the Azure implementation of any of this. You own everything that goes in, you own everything that goes out. What I like about Azure, which is actually what we use, everything's encrypted as well, all the way through the process. So they can't even see what you're doing. Yeah.
That rule change that they put in, is that retroactive?
No. No. If you use something prior to this, and I don't know the exact date when this changed, I think it was early summer sometime, when it was a massive change of even who owned what was going in, right? And I had a bunch of clients that had issues with, not them, but third-party vendors that took their data and ran it through AI, because it was kind of really ramping up then. And luckily, we were just after the cutoff. But I can't remember if maybe June 1st, June 13th maybe sticks in my mind. Something like that is when it changed. So for OpenAI, every other AI, you have to find out. If you're going to use Bard, you have to look at their EULA and figure out what that EULA is. So, and you have to keep up to date on that. That's one of the things when we talk about an AI strategy team, that's one of the jobs is you have to, like, here's the tools we're using, and at least every quarter be reviewing what do these EULAs look like and how is it impacting us, what's changed, to make sure we're updating for that. All right, so I just want to talk through this one because it's such an interesting thing. I don't have a demo to go with this, but how would you approach writing a blog post? I think it helps to think about like how you would do these things. And so we'll kind of walk through this as an example. Like if you were going to sit down and try to do this, I want to have a tool that creates a weekly blog post for me, and I just want to tell it the topic for the week. How would you do that? Any ideas? Say that again.
Didn't outline what you want it to say.
Yep.
Or use the information.
So find out where you can get the information to support that. Is that what you're saying? And the information.
Set of rules that it writes it the way you want it to write it.
Yes. All right. So that is getting into the prompting of defining how we want the output to look, right? So you guys, that's a critical piece, but that's at the end once we have the information. So there's a series of prompts you're going to use for this process. So the first set is, where do we want to research? Where are the sources that are acceptable for us to find the information we want to use, right? So you can define that and not say, I don't want anybody on the internet, you know, I want to narrow this down to where I think are valid sources. So that's step one. Now go do the research, and the research piece is a whole puzzle of probably several prompts to do this, to actually refine and summarize and pull out the data you want out of that. Then you're going to actually execute that, where that's where we call agents, right? To go query the web, pull this down, drop it to a file, pull this down, and I'm going to go get 10 or 20 or 50 of these posts that I already went out and researched and found articles on or research on or whatever I'm trying to do. Now, we want to define our voice and our audience, which is what you're talking about, and I want to teach it how I want that output to be written. And most likely, this is going to exceed our 4,000 token limit, so we have to do this in chunks. So we have to say, now write the first part of this, but I want the first part to sound like the second part, right? So what we do is we put it all together and then we run it back through again and summarize it again into that format with our voice and everything to actually get the detail into something that we can output. Now the problem with like a book where this is really big, it gets really complicated because you keep feeding that back with different chunks to actually keep it all consistent in the same voice, which is really tricky. There is a thing we're not going to talk about today, but all of this has a memory that you have control over. Like we've talked about your documents. Your documents are kind of one type of memory that you're providing to it. But there's ways to do both short-term and long-term memory as you think about multiple AI processes together, which gets really, really interesting, and it's really, really complicated. It is all the talk in the industry right now about how people are doing this differently, and there's a lot to figure out, but it's a really, really fun process to kind of figure out, like, when should it, like how much should I keep in memory? How much of the memory can I insert into my messages? How much can't I? Like when should you do that? How much from short term? How much from long term? It's a really, really fascinating thing. And it impacts things like this where it's going to be a whole series of processes around a flow, and we need a memory associated with this run versus the next time I run this for the next blog post, right? So that is our process that we ran through there, and we end up with a blog post. So just to wrap up, back to what we talked about this morning. Number one, actually play with ChatGPT. Learn something about this. Try some of these scenarios. If you get stuck, ask it to ask you questions. Tell it, here's what I want to accomplish. How would you do this? Lots of times there are, what do they call them? I forget what they call them, but there are things that chat can't do. It's trained to not do, right? It could do it, but they have limits on it. And you can get around a lot of those by asking it that question where it's like, I want you to go figure this out. And a lot of times they're not harmful things, but it's still blocked because it could lead to harmful things. So they actually ask you, if you go ask it, how would you approach this? You'll actually get the answer. And it'll guide you itself. So leverage AI to guide you to figure out how to use AI. Very, very powerful. The second thing is set up an AI strategy team in your organization. It's critical to think about, a lot of you guys are system engineers, managing IT departments for customers or internally. This is not go do this and be done. It's managed like a technology in that you have to keep up with this and you have to keep it up to date. But it's also managed like a human experience. Like how we're going to relate to this is very conversational. You don't need technology to do that, but we have to manage it when we implement it like a technology. Set up your own data sources. Now there's lots of ways to do this, which is really exciting. And then lastly, this is where it gets fun. What we just did is talking about the flows, where you can do real data flows with prompts. You still need your prompting experience in order to make those data flows pay off. So what you're learning when you're doing the chat part applies to what we're doing when we're doing analyzing data or building other more complicated process, but that's the foundation for it. Any questions? Any thoughts? Like, anybody have a really good use case that they would love to try a flow on, or to even talk through? How would you approach it?
Well, I like to go back to the brewery question.
Yeah.
There's certain things that are obvious, like there's a gaming within your zip code, chances are you're going to have increased traffic. But I still, that there's these unknown factors that you may not realize. Maybe there's a church in an area that has congregation meetings that night, then they go drink afterwards. How would you use AI to try and find those, at first glance, unseen factors that can influence not just patronage of the brewery, but other factors? That's conversation we have to find the things you don't know.
So this is where it's really interesting. So we have a take on what we want to build, but we don't know if we're right? So I have a whole bunch of inputs. ChatGPT gave me some more inputs, things we need to look up. But there's a whole bunch of unknowns, like you're saying, that I don't know. So how do I handle that? Well, this is no different than how you deal with this today. I use my past data to evaluate how close this is, so we can apply this backwards. Say, did this work? I'm always 10% low. Well, we have some problems in our model that we need to get that up. Or in these cases, what's driving these specific cases that are outliers in this? So this is no different than your normal data analytics processes, but then it drives how you're going to change your behavior with your AI to actually improve it. Any other questions?
How about a use case to predict the next Powerball drawing?
Isn't that random? Isn't that random? I mean, it can write you a random number generator. Yeah.
So if you write that code and you make a little mistake in how you write the code, how do you keep it from spending a fortune before you...
You can program that in. So one of the things you can do, and I intentionally thought, I'm a wise guy, I want to run this a bunch and do a bunch of testing, so I bumped my number up to like $1,000 and tell me after $1,000, well, I hit my limit, and I paid $1,000. So, but their default is $120 a month in spend, right? And you can change that to whatever you want. You can change, there's actually two levels. There's like, here's the cutoff, and I want to be notified 20% before that or whatever. So you have controls over that with almost every product that I've seen out there. The bigger problem with that is you've written something that is a function. We didn't talk too much about this, but now a function is going to go execute something on your system. How do you track what the call was? And there's ways to log this, and it's really critical, and debug that. So I understand, oh, in this case, it actually ran this instead of this, and I didn't expect that. So those are the more complicated things to debug. But the tools for building the flows and for debugging the flows are catching up. But this is why we're kind of on this evolution, and the large language models are there, the chat is there, and now it's like getting to the flows and eventually these bots that are helping us out. So, any other questions?
Throughout your presentation, you mainly stuck on ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Are there other GPT models out there that are better at other use cases, or do you know mostly just about GPT? Or
So I use OpenAI stuff mostly because, partially because of the licensing arrangement through Microsoft. So we use it through Azure. So that's probably the number one case. However, I'm running open source models on my laptop, not this laptop. This laptop's crazy, but on my good laptop, I'm running open source models, which is really cool. And they're not at, so there's ChatGPT 3.5, which was kind of the bar, and then they came out with Turbo, which was really, really fast actually, and half the price then. And now on Monday, they went from GPT-4, which is way, way, way better responses, especially if you're doing anything coding-wise. There's lots of scenarios. So there are people that test this, and if you go out to YouTube and search this, you can find all sorts of test videos that compete this against this against this in all these different categories. So that's out there. I keep up with that. OpenAI is by far the best across the board, and GPT-4 and now with GPT-4 Turbo is fantastic. The problem is I can't make enough calls. So we're working on becoming an enterprise customer of them directly because I can't make enough calls. We're limited. Seriously, so that's a problem. But we have things that we say, when we built out these flows, I say this, a summary process, I want this to be GPT-4 because it's critical to get the voice right, and it's so much better. I want to go look up some data. I will use 3.5 to do that because it gives exactly the same answer. So other models are out there. Bard actually, Bard got off to a rough start 6 months ago or 12 months ago. It is caught up and it's equivalent in a lot of areas. The one from Amazon, I can never remember their, Bedrock. Bedrock actually is better at coding than any of the other ones. It's kind of interesting. But it really falls short in a lot of other areas. There are other models, and you can create your own models. If you go out to Hugging Face, huggingface.com is a website for open source models and lots of other tools and stuff open source. Everything basically data science. On Hugging Face, there are tons and tons of open source models that you can implement for all sorts of very specific processes, right? So rather than being an LLM and being trained on everything, I can get a very specific process that I could even program in on my phone to do something with AI for that specific process. So that's just way more advanced, and we're getting there by using, what I love about the chat is anybody, you don't have to be technical, you can start to use this in almost everything you're doing every day and start to get experience, and as we go down that path, I think everybody is going to be branching out and looking at using custom models eventually. We're not there. Like most people aren't there yet. Although they've been around for years and years and years. I have implemented several AI models over the last 25 years. Back in, I think, 1998, I implemented a model for Land O'Lakes to help, they get milk in every day, right? And the output product changes by how long you have it. Right? So you have a mild cheddar, and then later you have a sharp cheddar, and later it becomes American cheese, right? So it's like there's a flow to the process. So the question is, how much butter do they need for Thanksgiving? Because that's when all their butter sales are. So between like middle of November and the end of December. So it's like planning for these things that they know they need to hit. What can they do with the rest of the product? Because the product comes in regardless. So we used AI to do a bunch of that back 20-some years ago. So very specific trained model, though.
Loren, I want to say thank you for this. And I do want to say for anyone else who has other questions, Model Mind does have their booth. Please stop by, talk to their team if you have more specifics. It's excellent. Thank you for this.